right now, if you don't have a defined purpose, your brain's physical hardware is actively degrading into complexity-induced anxiety.
Yeah, it's literally breaking down.
Exactly. I mean, we usually treat finding your purpose as this, fluffy, abstract life advice. You picture a motivational poster, someone telling you to follow your heart, maybe a sunset or something.
Right, a cat hanging from a branch.
Yeah, exactly. But when you step into the world of neurodevelopment, that poster just gets ripped off the wall. We are looking at a landscape today that isn't poetry at all. It is cold, hard plumbing.
It really is. It's the absolute definition of biological necessity.
Yeah.
I mean, the human brain is basically a prediction machine, right? It's constantly trying to manage just an overwhelming amount of sensory data.
And without a structural anchor.
Without a specific aim to organize that data around, the neural networks literally cannot prioritize. So the system floods, the stress response kicks in permanently, and the cognitive architecture just begins to fray.
Wow. Well, welcome to the deep dive. If you're listening to this and wondering why certain goals feel, effortless while others feel like a grinding uphill battle, we are unpacking a stack of fascinating sources today.
We really are.
We're looking at frameworks from Talent Whisperers, alongside a pretty profound lecture by Dr. Jordan Peterson to explore the literal neurobiology of purpose. Because the premise here is striking, a philosophical concept like aim physically alters your brain's circuitry. So, okay, let's unpack this. How does simply choosing a goal change our biological reality?
Well, we have to start at the very beginning of human perception, I think. Jordan Peterson makes this compelling, biologically grounded argument that aim, having a defined goal, is the primary filter for human experience.
Meaning it changes what we literally see.
Exactly. It dictates the actual physical manifestation of the world to you. We tend to think of our positive and negative emotions as passive reactions to things happening to us. Like a good thing happens, we feel happy. A bad thing happens, we feel sad.
Right, cause and effect.
Right, but biologically, those emotions are dopaminergic orienting mechanisms.
Wait, orienting mechanisms, so they function more like a biological navigation system.
Precisely. Your ancient brain, specifically areas like the hypothalamus, uses the dopamine system to just tell you if you're on the right trajectory. The emotion is simply a feedback signal.
Oh, that makes so much sense.
Yeah, so if your brain perceives you're moving toward your aim, it releases a hit of dopamine. You feel zest, engagement, positive emotion. If you deviate from the path, the dopamine drops and you feel negative emotion or anxiety.
But, and this is the kicker, that entire GPS mechanism is completely blind and totally useless unless a destination is actually programmed into it.
Exactly, you need the coordinates.
In the sources, Peterson uses this wild hypothetical to illustrate how fast this GPS can recalculate. He describes a man who comes home and, unfortunately, finds out his wife is having an affair.
Right, a brutal situation.
Yeah, totally devastating. Initially, the man is completely crushed. He's bitter, angry, betrayed. And neurologically, that makes total sense, right? Because his programmed aim was, I am maintaining a happy, stable marriage.
Yeah, so the affair is a massive deviation from that aim.
Right, so the biological feedback is intense negative emotion.
It registers as a catastrophic threat to his established reality.
Exactly. But then Peterson says, imagine this guy goes to a bar, has a few drinks, and in a moment of clarity realizes he has actually been miserable for a decade and never really liked his wife anyway.
Oh, wow, yeah.
In that moment, he changes his aim to, I want to be free of this marriage.
And instantly, the emotional valence of the exact same physical reality completely inverts. I mean, the facts in the physical world didn't change at all.
Not one bit.
The affair still happened, the marriage is still over. But because his aim shifted, his biological GPS recalculated the route. What was previously registering as a devastating deviation from the goal is now suddenly registering as forward progress toward the new goal.
Which is just wild to think about. The disaster triggers a dopaminergic reward.
Yeah, the world manifests entirely based on the aim.
But there has to be, a physical mechanism in the brain actually executing that shift, right? We aren't just talking about a change in attitude. We are talking about what sensory data the brain even allows into consciousness.
Oh, there absolutely is. There is a very specific piece of hardware driving this called the reticular activating system, or the RAS.
T.R.I.V.E, right?
Yeah, it's a network of neurons located right in the brainstem, and it acts as an active filtering mechanism. At any given second, your nervous system is bombarded by roughly 11 million bits of sensory data.
11 million? That's insane.
It's massive.
Yeah.
And you can only consciously process about 40 to 50 bits per second.
Wait, really? Only 40 or 50 out of 11 million?
Yeah. If your brain tried to process everything, you would experience immediate psychotic fragmentation.
Wow, so the RAS is almost like a pair of high-end noise-canceling headphones. It isn't just passively blocking sound, it is actively generating a counterfrequency to mute almost all of those 11 million bits of data, only letting the specific frequency of your aim pass through into conscious awareness.
That is the exact mechanism. When you define a core, why, you are tuning the frequency of the RAS. Suddenly, you start noticing resources, conversations, pathways that were always physically present in your environment, but your brain was previously actively muting them as irrelevant noise.
The sources refer to this as cognitive manifestation.
Right, exactly. You aren't using magic to summon opportunities out of thin air. Your brain just literally stopped generating the counter frequency to ignore them.
But hold on, if the RAS just filters for whatever we program into it, couldn't someone just program it with a fake superficial goal they saw on Instagram?
People do that all the time.
Right. Does the brain actually know the difference between an authentic, deeply held purpose and a borrowed one? Like, if my aim is, I want the status car and the perfect morning routine, that's an aim. Will the brain accept that?
Well, it will initially, but it won't sustain it. And that is exactly where people get trapped. The sources call this the Milli Vanilli effect.
The Milli Vanilli effect, I love that.
Right. You can consciously tell your RAS to filter for a superficial goal. You might even start noticing opportunities to get that status car. But because that goal isn't rooted in what Peterson terms authentic being, it just lacks structural integrity.
Meaning it's hollow.
Completely hollow. Superficial goals don't trigger the deep limbic resonance required to sustain dopamine production over the long term. So the moment you hit severe, agonizing adversity, the biological fuel just runs out. The system recognizes the metabolic cost isn't worth the superficial reward, and the whole facade shatters.
So how do we find the authentic frequency then? I mean, if we are surrounded by social conditioning and advertising telling us what our goals should be, how do we actually program the RAS with a structurally sound core why?
The Talent Whispers framework provides a great diagnostic tool for this. It's called the 5 Whys. It's basically an excavation process.
Okay, how does it work?
When you identify a goal, you ask yourself, why does this matter? The first answer is almost always a socially acceptable justification. Then you ask why to that answer, and you just repeat this 5 times.
5 layers down.
Yeah, the second and third layers usually reveal ego drives or financial anxieties, but by the time you force yourself to answer the 5th why, you strip away the surface-level noise and hit the raw, structural truth of your existence.
The deep existential driver.
Exactly. If you skip this integrity check, you risk spending a decade optimizing your neurobiology to climb a ladder that is just leaning against the wrong wall.
Wow. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's say we have done the 5 whys. We found the structural truth. Our RAS is tuned like those noise-canceling headphones to the right frequency, and we can clearly see the path forward.
Wait, the target is locked.
But seeing the path and having the biological fuel to walk it when the path gets steep, icy, and exhausting, those are 2 entirely different things. How does a structural truth turn into physical action when the friction gets high?
This is where we move from perception to power. The biology actually shifts to a structure called the anterior midcingulate cortex, or the AMCC.
The AMCC.
Yes, the sources refer to this as the resilience engine. The AMCC is uniquely positioned in the brain. It sits right at the intersection of the prefrontal cortex, which is your logical planning center, and the limbic system, which is your emotional and autonomic center.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because the AMCC is the exact neural hub where effort meets meaning. It isn't just firing blindly, it is running an incredibly complex, real-time algorithm.
It really is. It calculates what neuroscientists call the expected value of control, or EVC. Whenever you face a difficult task, the AMCC is weighing the metabolic cost of the effort against the expected reward, and it gathers data from a very specific internal team to make this calculation.
Right. The sources describe this internal dialogue beautifully. You have the insula, which is constantly measuring your internal state. It's tracking the glucose depletion in your blood, the rising heart rate, the muscle fatigue.
It's an internal monitor.
Exactly. Then you have the amygdala, the threat detection center, which responds to that friction by releasing cortisol and sounding the alarm. And finally, you have the prefrontal cortex, the CEO, trying to keep the long-term goal in sight.
Yeah, so when you hit a major obstacle, the insula reports the metabolic drain. The amygdala spikes cortisol and essentially screams, "This is causing damage, stop immediately."
Panic mode.
Right. And if you were operating on a borrowed, superficial goal, going back to the Milli Vanilli effect, The prefrontal cortex looks at the data, agrees with the amygdala, and tells the AMCC the effort isn't worth the cost. The expected value of control is negative, the engine stalls, and you quit.
But if that task is tethered to a deeply validated core why from our 5 whys exercise, the entire equation changes.
It flips completely.
The prefrontal cortex basically sends a localized signal to the AMCC to override the amygdala's cortisol spike. It reframes the physiological friction not as a threat to survival, but as a necessary metabolic burn for the mission.
Exactly. The AMCC recalculates the EVC, decides the reward is mathematically worth the pain, and physically recruits the motor cortex to keep your legs moving.
It literally generates biological torque.
Yes, and the most critical takeaway from the source material is that when you engage in this process, when you purposefully execute voluntary exposure to difficulty connected to meaning, you physically alter the AMCC.
Wait, physically alter it.
Yes. You increase the gray matter volume and the density of the neurons in that specific region. Neuroplasticity occurs. You are building a larger, more robust physical engine for future adversity.
So we aren't just adapting psychologically. We're essentially demanding structural renovations in the brain.
That's exactly what's happening.
But, if voluntary exposure to friction physically grows the AMCC, the logical conclusion seems to be that we should seek out maximum friction all the time. Doesn't this justify that extreme hustle culture mentality? Like, just redline the system, endure maximum pain, and push until you break. Because that's how you build the biggest engine.
Oh man, no. The sources explicitly warn against that interpretation. That brute force approach leads to severe neurological burnout. Resilience is not built by enduring catastrophic stress.
Okay, so how is it built?
It is built through a highly precise process called resilience threshold calibration. Growth requires friction, sure, but if you push the nervous system too far, you cross into what the framework calls the snap zone.
And the snap zone isn't just a metaphor for feeling overwhelmed, right? There's a profound chemical shift happening that completely halts the growth we just talked about.
Absolutely. When the stress becomes unmanageable and you enter the snap zone, the amygdala triggers an absolute flood of cortisol. At those extreme levels, cortisol physically binds to receptors in the hippocampus and blocks the consolidation of new neural pathways.
Oh, wow. So you literally cannot learn while you are panicking.
Exactly. The friction goes from being a metabolic burn that builds the AMCC to a destructive force that fractures your cognitive capacity. Adaptation only happens at the exact boundary of your current capacity, which the sources call the stretch zone.
This maps perfectly onto that skiing story from the sources.
Oh yeah, the 100-fold day.
Yeah. The author takes his friend Joe, who is basically a novice, to the top of a mountain with expert terrain and near gale force winds. On paper, that sounds like pure snap zone. It sounds like firing a cannonball into the dark.
Total disaster waiting to happen.
Right. If they had pointed their skis straight down a black diamond run, Joe's cortisol would have spiked, his hippocampus would have shut down, and it would have been an exercise in trauma, not learning.
But they didn't fire a cannonball. They fired bullets.
Bullets.
They broke the descent into dozens of micro-traverses. They took 100 small, calculated risks, which resulted in 100 safe, manageable falls.
Because the falls were small, the amygdala didn't perceive a threat to survival. The cortisol stayed manageable. Joe stayed in the stretch zone, getting a tiny hit of dopamine with each micro-correction, keeping neuroplasticity wide open all the way down the mountain.
Exactly.
But if you're navigating your own challenges, how do you know where that boundary actually is? How do you know you are in the stretch zone and not sliding into the snap zone?
Well, the framework provides a 30-second threshold calibration check, which relies on reading your own physiological signals. If a task feels completely automatic, your attention is easily drifting, and there's no physical sense of effort, you're below the threshold. Your engine is just idling.
And if I start to feel frantic, like my vision literally feels like it's narrowing, I'm making rapid mistakes but not learning anything from them, and my heart rate is hammering with anxiety.
That is the insula and amygdala signaling that you have crossed into the snap zone.
The cortisol is blocking consolidation.
Exactly. When you feel that frantic narrowing, you have to reduce the load or step away immediately. You want to dial it back to the stretch zone, the state where your focus sharpens significantly. You feel highly alert. You are absolutely making mistakes, but the mistakes feel informative rather than threatening. You sense the metabolic effort, but it feels metabolizable.
Okay, so we have the fuel from our core work. Why? We have the AMCC generating the torque to push through the friction, and we are using threshold calibration to stay safely in the stretch zone. But how do we operationalize this? Let's map that exact skiing scenario onto the operational framework the sources provide for building learned resilience, the T.H.R.I.V.E. loop.
Yeah, the T.H.R.I.V.E loop is the exact behavioral mechanism that drives the neurobiology we've been discussing. The T stands for target. In the skiing example, Joe didn't target the bottom of the mountain. He targeted a right-sized challenge, just the next 10 feet of snow. He kept the target within the stretch zone.
Then Ages hypothesized he wasn't just winging it. He formed a testable plan for that specific 10-foot traverse. It reduces the cognitive noise because the prefrontal cortex only has to calculate the EVC for a micro-movement, not the whole mountain.
Exactly. Then R is reach. This is the biological trigger, taking the step into discomfort. This is the precise moment the AMCC fires, overriding the baseline desire to stay safe and stationary.
Which inevitably leads to a fall, bringing us to I inspect, evaluating the outcome blamelessly. If Joe sat in the snow and shamed himself for falling, his cortisol would spike, shutting down the learning. By inspecting the fall purely as mechanical data like, oh, I leaned too far back, he keeps the hippocampus open.
Right. Then he moves to V-value, extracting the meaning. This is the rapid reflection phase where the brain converts the physical mistake into a neural asset, tweaking the modal pattern for the next attempt.
And finally, E-energize, intentional recovery. High performers know the AMCC cannot run hot indefinitely. You have to allow the nervous system to return to baseline so the entire loop can be executed again.
And when you run that loop repeatedly, you trigger the final, most permanent biological adaptation discussed in the sources, myelination. This is the infrastructure of speed.
I want to dig into this because we often hear about myelination just as muscle memory or insulation, but the actual physiology of how it works is incredible. It's not just a passive coding.
No, it is a highly active dynamic process. When you execute the T.H.R.I.V.E loop, electrical signals or action potentials travel down the axons of your neurons. In your brain, there are specialized cells called oligodendrocytes.
Oligodendrocytes, got it.
Yeah, these cells actually monitor the neural circuitry, waiting to sense that specific electrical firing.
So when Joe targets, reaches, and values his microadjustments on the skis, the oligodendrocytes detect the electrical activity in those specific motor and cognitive pathways.
Exactly. And in response to that firing, they physically reach out and wrap the axon in myelin, which is a dense lipid-rich substance. Myelin prevents the electrical signal from leaking out of the axon. But more importantly, it changes how the signal travels.
Oh, so?
Instead of moving continuously, the electrical impulse physically jumps from node to node along the myelin sheath. This increases the transmission speed exponentially.
So the AMCC acts as the heavy-duty engine, providing the willpower to blaze a trail through the dense jungle of a new skill. But every time you run the T.H.R.I.V.E loop, the oligodendrocytes come behind you and literally pave a highway over that trail.
That's a great way to put it.
The more loops you run, the thicker the myelin gets. What once required massive metabolic effort and willpower from the AMCC eventually becomes an automatic high-speed reflex running on heavily myelinated circuitry.
That is the complete closed-loop biology of what the sources call learned manifestation. It takes the concept of manifesting your reality completely out of the realm of passive wishing. You are utilizing dopamine to orient your RAS, leveraging the AMCC to endure the stretch zone, and employing the T.H.R.I.V.E loop to literally command your oligodendrocytes to build high-speed neural infrastructure.
You are actively engineering your own biological capacity to interact with the world. I mean, to recap this journey, we started by realizing that to get the RAS noise-canceling headphones to let the right opportunities in, you must find a structural truth using the 5 whys.
Right.
When you face the inevitable friction on that path, your core why allows the prefrontal cortex to convince the AMCC that the metabolic burn is worth it. You carefully calibrate to stay in the stretch zone, avoiding the cortisol flood of the snap zone. And by constantly running the T.H.R.I.V.E loop, you physically pave your brain's circuits with myelin, turning agonizing friction into effortless mastery.
It is a phenomenal biological system. But, the sources leave us with one final, deeply provocative concept. The Talent Whisperer's texts map out resilience across various domains, cognitive, physical, emotional. But then they introduce an overarching 11th dimension that contains all of this biology.
Wait, the 11th dimension?
Yeah, it is our perceptual universe.
Yeah.
The profound realization here is that the RAS, the AMCC, the dopamine, the cortisol, none of these operate in an objective, fixed reality. They operate exclusively inside a reality constructed and filtered through your unique memory, your past traumas, your distinct identity, and your deeply held beliefs.
Oh, wow. So the biological hardware is identical, but the data being fed into it is entirely subjective, which means two people can experience the exact same physical event, yet their internal biology processes entirely different realities.
Precisely. A specific challenge that triggers a massive cortisol flood and pushes one person instantly into the snap zone might register to another person's highly myelinated, purpose-driven nervous system as a dopaminergic initiation into the stretch zone.
Because of how they perceive it.
Right. They aren't inherently superior. Their internal mirrors are simply tuned to different frequencies of meaning. True resilience isn't just about forcing your biology to endure the circumstances you're handed. It is the meta-awareness to recognize the perceptual lens you're looking through.
You have the agency to adjust the mirror. So, if you are listening to this right now, look at the friction in your own life. Look at the challenges making your amygdala sound the alarm. Ask yourself, are you struggling because you are adapting to an unchangeable fixed reality? Or is your biological engine just stalling out because it's starved of a core why?
Exactly. Change the aim, change the reality.
Remember, finding your purpose isn't poetry, it's plumbing. You have the exact biological tools required to rewire the hardware. You just have to do the work to choose the aim. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.